The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
What a day, what a day. A bombshell report claims that Donald Trump knowingly conducted illegal business in communist Cuba during Fidel Castro's reign in the 1990s. There is a Newsweek cover story today by Kurt Eichenwald, who has been a guest on this program, and it is called The Castro Connection. And it claims, and if this is true, it is devastating for Donald Trump, and I'll tell you more about why in a second. The story claims that Donald Trump spent at least $68,000 in 1998 for a business foray into Cuba, even though corporate activity in Cuba was completely illegal without government approval at the time. We've only recently, under President Obama, started to see a loosening of the Cuban embargo. And every indication, according to the article, is that with Donald Trump's knowledge, executives from Trump hotels and casino resorts funneled cash through an American consulting firm called Seven Arrows Investment and Development Corporation into Cuba. The report is damning. It claims that Seven Arrows consultants would travel to Cuba to look for potential business opportunities and then explain to Trump, here's how we're going to sort of get around our actual intentions here by linking these business efforts to completely bogus and made up charitable efforts. Now, for people who will hear this and they say, David, it sounds really, really far-fetched, remember, Donald Trump has a very long history of very weird stuff going on with charitable donations. He's got this Donald J. Trump Foundation, which, number one, he has not donated to since 2008, which, number two, has clearly been used as a way to buy political capital with favors and donors' money. Number three, he seems to have drastically overstated his donations to veterans and tried to make up for that during the campaign by on stage at a rally donating to a veterans organization, which in and of itself may have been illegal because he was using charitable donations for political gain on stage at a rally. So there's no shock, there's no surprise that part of this entire alleged Cuba incident also involves misusing supposed charitable donations. Now, as if this weren't already enough, the article by Kurt Eichenwald says that this all happened right before Donald Trump launched his first presidential bid seeking the nomination of the Reform Party. So potentially incriminating allegations here. This is after Donald Trump at the debate on Monday said he was smart for not paying federal taxes. This has the potential to single-handedly crush the Donald Trump campaign. This is what I like to call casually as light to medium treason. It has serious implications. Criminal penalties for violation of these sanctions range up to 10 years in prison, up to $1 million in corporate fines, up to $250,000 in individual fines. And of course, and more than likely, it would be this way if we ever were to see any charges anyway, civil penalties of up to $55,000 per violation. But all legal implications aside, this could destroy Trump's chances in Florida. Cuban Floridians, who generally speaking, Cubans are the most conservative of Hispanic groups. They're very anti-Castro. Finding out that Donald Trump was doing business with Fidel Castro could single-handedly turn Florida towards Hillary Clinton. And if you've looked at the maps, it's a pretty tough path to 270 electoral votes for Donald Trump without Florida.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure this isn't going to stick on its own, but we know that he has a history of doing these things that may have a conflict of interest. Yeah. And it's why he has to release his tax returns, so the public knows that simply using the excuse that, well, I'm being audited by the IRS, it's not going to cut it anymore. We're going to actually dig more into that tomorrow. It's not like Donald Trump has never released his taxes. He's actually released his taxes for other in other situations, and we're going to get into that tomorrow. But as Pat is pointing out, seemingly continuing to say absolutely no taxes at all for this presidential race that I am involved here. So
Number one, if this sticks, and we will see, these are allegations, we are going to see what the response is. As of right now, there has been no response yet from the Trump campaign about the story. This will hurt Donald Trump with Cuban Americans in Florida. That is going to be a problem in Florida specifically, but it also would give Hillary Clinton huge ammunition for ads and whatever else can be used in future debates, etc. Cubans in Florida really hate Fidel Castro, and this is not going to be good for Donald Trump in what is a very important state. I would do a wellness check on Ted Cruz right now. I bet he is not thrilled after he sort of abstained from endorsing Donald Trump for so long. Finally says, yeah, I'm going to vote for the guy. And then now a few days later, it comes out that Trump may have been illegally doing business with Fidel Castro in Cuba. Absolutely amazing. If you turn this into a movie script, it would be rejected because it's just, who would buy this stuff? It's just not believable. I want to talk about an angle to the recent presidential debate that we've not yet discussed. We did a lot of discussion about Donald Trump's lies. We did quite a bit of discussion about the issues that were covered and where areas in which Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump did well or didn't do well. But we haven't talked so much about what wasn't talked about in that first presidential debate. And there's a really interesting article that I would take a look at if I were you, by Adam Johnson of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. And it goes into what topics were not covered in the first presidential debate. And very often, looking at the absence of something tells us just as much or more at looking at the presence of something. For example, when we looked at corporate media coverage of Occupy Wall Street, on the one hand, we could look at, well, Fox News was much more aggressively negative about the protesters as people versus CNN that was much more positive about the protesters as people, etc. But what was missing from all of corporate media in the coverage of Occupy Wall Street was, hey, let's discuss areas in which capitalism has served us well and areas in which capitalism has not served us well, which was really one of the main points of Occupy Wall Street that was missing from corporate media coverage about Occupy Wall Street. So let's apply that now in looking at Adam Johnson's article about what was missing from the presidential debate. The article makes some good points, but I don't agree with everything that's being said. Some of the topics that Adam Johnson points to as being missing, I think there's a pretty good case to be made that they should not really be debate topics. And I'm going to get into that, okay? So how did the topics play out? We were told the first debate was about achieving prosperity, America's direction, and securing America. It played out as basically an opportunity for a lot of discussion of everything from emails, insults, tax returns, etc. Not invalid topics, but really not particularly substantive policy discussion. So Adam Johnson points out, listen, in this debate, we had no questions about poverty. We had no questions or discussion about abortion, not really anything about climate change, immigration, which has been a huge part of Trump's fear-mongering campaign, was essentially missing, healthcare, student debt, privacy, LGBT rights, drug policy, missing from the debate. So here's what I want to suggest to you, our audience. Some of these issues are very notable because they are issues of importance and they are very valuable issues to discuss. For example, immigration, huge issue. It's being used to push people for and or against candidates. Donald Trump has made it a central element of his campaign, not discussed. Poverty, huge issue. Poverty is an issue of paramount importance, not discussed within that first debate. But some of these other issues, I'm less convinced really have a place in national political debate. So I'm going to give you an example, right? Let's talk about abortion. Abortion is a legal medical procedure. I would say that it is a victory. It says a lot about our country if abortion is not part of national presidential campaigns, because really, particularly now that more than half of Americans, for the first time since Roe v. Wade, say that abortion should be legal in most cases, there really shouldn't be anything controversial about abortion. Now, I know you'll hear me say this and you'll say, well, David, You may be right that there shouldn't be anything controversial, but there is still huge opposition to abortion, particularly among the Republican right, the evangelical religious right. A lot of money is being raised around being against abortion. So it is controversial. And you're right. And I completely agree with you. But the absence of abortion in a national debate, I believe, is by and large a good thing. Let me give you another example. LGBT rights. LGBT rights really should not be controversial. If you want to get married to someone, you should be able to get married to that person regardless of what genitals you or they were born with. That's absolutely clear to me. If you work at a job, you should not be able to be fired because of your perceived or actual sexual orientation. There should be no discrimination allowed based on gender. We shouldn't be dealing with laws about which bathroom can you use and how can you prove which bathroom you can use. So I think it is progress if LGBT rights no longer have to be parts of these presidential debates. However, and you're absolutely right if you're about to tell me, but David, there is discrimination. You still can be fired in many states for your perceived or actual sexual orientation, so it should be part of the debate. I agree with you. But my big picture reaction is poverty being missing from a presidential debate and LGBT rights discussions being missing from a presidential debate. They are different because one is an issue that is objectively an issue that needs to be fixed and dealt with, whereas the other is something that is only an issue because of retrograde conservatives.
Well, one thing they definitely should have talked about is corruption in politics.
Yeah.
I mean, to this day, we don't know Donald Trump's position on Citizens United.
Yeah. Well, the reason we're not going to see too much discussion in national debates, what you're really getting at is campaign finance, is because no matter what 99.9% of national politicians say about, well, we've got to prevent this anonymous spending that you can do. They'll come up with some line. By and large, these major politicians are in power because of the system we have, and there's a huge disincentive for them to want to change it. So there's what I call sometimes, Pat, no-win topics, where to whose advantage is it to talk about it? Maybe Trump is actually better off on this one because he can say, hey, I'm not someone who has ever benefited as a recipient of the money that floats around, although he said he has been involved in buying politicians with donations. But there's really no upside, I think, to either of them to bring that up.
And not only to the candidates, too, but the commission on presidential debates run by the two parties and by the networks. Yeah, no, it's a lose-lose. And another example I gave was we hear Trump and Hillary Clinton both talk about, I'll bring jobs back. We're not going to keep sending jobs to Mexico. We're going to get ourselves out of trade agreements. Whatever their policies are, neither of them says, hey, you know what? We are going to lose millions of jobs in the next 15 years because of automation, because it's zero. You gain absolutely nothing if you're Trump or Clinton by admitting no matter what she says, no matter what he says, no matter what I say, there are going to be jobs lost. It's a loser. It's not going to get you any votes whatsoever. So not all absent topics created equally is my reaction to Adam Johnson's article about what wasn't discussed at the debate. Let me know what you think about this. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman, and of course we are all on Facebook at facebook.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Jonathan Billion. Jonathan, thank you so much for being a David Pakman Show member. This is truly viewer and listener supported media. We joke around a lot about the membership program, but really the only reason that the program is now 5 days a week is because of the success of membership and members signing up. You can get all of the great member benefits, including, of course, the world famous bonus show by signing up at davidpakman.com/membership. I have a interesting documentary to recommend to you today. It is a documentary called The Vasectomist, and it follows, I call him an eccentric and quirky doctor who travels the world. His mission, this is Dr. Doug Stein, his mission is to just continue doing vasectomies, and he's motivated by population control because of climate change and limited resources on Earth. So Dr. Doug Stein, who does vasectomies, believes that we are rapidly barreling towards an unsustainable situation on Earth with regard to resource consumption, population, and the way that this will impact our environment. So he travels the world all over the place. In the US, he drives around in this old minivan that you see in the documentary. He goes all over the world doing vasectomies. And he's reportedly done something like 25,000 vasectomies at this point, I believe. 30,000 vasectomies. It's a pretty big number. And he's a quirky guy. And part of the fascinating thing about the film is the way in which in many countries, vasectomy is incredibly controversial. In religious countries, vasectomy is hugely controversial. That's interesting. The other interesting element of this documentary is that Dr. Stein is just incredibly peculiar and quirky, and that's interesting to see. The one thing I don't like about the documentary is when vasectomies are done, there's a particular snapping noise that to most people with male genitals is not a noise you want to hear coming from that area. And just be prepared for that if you're going to check out the documentary. It is called The Vasectomist, and you can see all of my recommendations at davidpakman.com/recommendations. Okay, big news from last night. President Obama experienced the first veto override of his presidency nearly 8 years into his presidency. So that is an accomplishment in and of itself. President Obama previously vetoed legislation which would allow relatives of 9/11 victims to sue Saudi Arabia. When the president vetoes a bill, the House and Senate can then come together and vote to override that veto. And that is exactly what happened last night. The House of Representatives voted 348 to 77 against President Obama's veto. And also the Senate voted 97 to 1 to reject that veto, meaning that the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act will indeed become the law. What this law will do is grant an exception. There's this legal principle called sovereign immunity in cases of terrorism on U.S. soil, meaning if people from foreign country X come to the U.S. and commit an act of terror, Americans are not able to sue country X because the people who did the act of terror came from their country. This law will create an exception to that legal principle. Saudi Arabia has for a long time denied the allegations that hijackers who attacked the U.S. on 9/11 were backed by the Saudi government or royal family. We know that 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi nationals. So that is going to change. Now, you might say, well, there's probably some other side to this, right? I mean, it sounds good if we have people in Saudi Arabia that we believe were funded by the Saudi government. We want to be able to sue them. What is being said as the counter is that this really does open up the door to the U.S. being sued when Americans go to other countries and perpetrate acts of terror or criminality abroad. And that's sort of like the main opposition that we've been hearing to this. That is sort of where the debate is mostly. CIA Director John Brennan said that there are, quote, grave implications for national security, because if this were to also be applied to the U.S., all of a sudden you have a potential liability sort of hanging out there that the United States could be sued in similar ways as to the way in which Saudi Arabia could potentially be sued as a result of this veto override. Within hours of the vote, nearly 30 senators signed a letter expressing that they have some reservations about the potential consequences of the law, including that the U.S. could be sued in foreign courts. What's fascinating to me about this, when I step back, number one, it's hard for me to imagine feeling really strongly about taking Saudi Arabia out of harm's way as part of our vile and totally depraved alliance with Saudi Arabia. But I had another thought, which is when we think about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? One of the things that TPP will do is it will make it so that transnational corporations, rather than being sued or litigated within one of the countries in which they operate, instead will be brought to some kind of international arbitration. And this is very, very dangerous. As progressives, we should be very concerned about that, because it allows these countries and major corporations, through the influence that they have, to set up a system where it's going to be really, really favorable to them, much more favorable to them than the justice system of any particular country in which they operate. It is getting us circumventing the individual justice systems of individual countries. This has a similar issue, like we are talking about when you say, well, now American citizens can sue the country of Saudi Arabia without being citizens of that country, without being legal residents of that country. You are also creating a sort of extrajudicial, at least when it comes to the country level mechanism. And that is something that we need to think about big picture. Now, I know that it's different in TPP and in what we're talking about here with suing Saudi Arabia. We're talking about two different mechanisms. But big picture, that's a lot of what is at issue here, which is going above and beyond the rules of the country in which one is a citizen or a permanent resident, and what the potential implications of that will be. So this is going to take some time to shake out. Those are some of the concerns that we've heard so far. We did learn this morning that there has been a really, really bad train crash in New Jersey. At last check, one person is dead and over 100 people have been injured when a New Jersey Transit commuter train crashed into the Hoboken station this morning. New Jersey's emergency management system is reporting that more than 100 people have been injured, one person so far found dead. Federal investigators are en route. The National Transportation Safety Board is gathering information. This hugely damaged the Hoboken Terminal building. I actually have a lot to say about this, and we don't yet have all the details about this particular crash. It appears as though the train was moving very quickly, at least too quickly, given that it was already in the station. You might have seen, if you've traveled on trains, that at the end of lines, you often have what sort of look like bumpers, and they're meant to stop the train if it's going too fast. Those only work up to a certain speed, and a friend of mine who works for Amtrak, it's not a high speed. I think he said it's something like, it's a 5 or 10 mile per hour bumper. If you think about the mass of a train, those bumpers are not going to be able to prevent a train going 20, 25, or 30 miles an hour from getting through necessarily. It appears as though, although the train did hit the bumper, it was going far too fast for the bumper to keep the train contained. It went off the tracks and did major, major damage to the station. We're still trying to figure out exactly what happened here. We don't know if the train engineer passed out, fell asleep, was otherwise incapacitated. Trains have a 60-second alerter, which requires the train operator to, within 60 seconds, every 60 seconds, they have to press something in the train to show, hey, I'm still with it, I'm still here. If they don't, the train will immediately slow down. The problem is that still allows for nearly 2 minutes. If you pass out or otherwise leave the locomotive or are incapacitated right after turning off the alerter, you have 60 full seconds before the train will start to brake. And then because it's not the most aggressive braking system, it can take, depending on the speed of the train at the time that the automatic braking engages, anywhere from 30 to 60 additional seconds for the train to stop. So we're talking about, even with the system working the way it's designed, 90 to 120 seconds of potentially unsupervised train operation. This gets to the broader problem with American trains, and you've heard me talk about this many times before. Number one, we have this general issue in the US where, because of the fossil fuel lobby, the airline lobby, and the automobile lobby, it is very difficult to make progress on train development. We recently saw Massachusetts-based bus company Peter Pan actively lobby to block a study into train service across Massachusetts. Why? Well, that's their bread and butter. They run something like 10 or so buses a day back and forth across the Massachusetts Turnpike. If all of a sudden you've got train service for that route, not subject to surface traffic, quite common on I-90, the Massachusetts Turnpike, it'll be bad for the bus companies. And this applies to short airline flights. This applies to people driving, etc. In addition to that, because we also have lacked this advancement in train development, we are missing some of the systems that other trains in other parts of the world have. For example, forget about the 60-second alerter. The maximum speed at any given point on the track is controlled by a computer, meaning that aside from this alerter, there would be no way if we had a system that said, once you are within, I don't know what distance it would be, call it half a mile of Hoboken Station, the train can't be going 30 miles per hour. By that point, the computer has already slowed the train down to 20 or 15 or whatever the case may be. So this really exposes just how antiquated and retrograde the United States is when it comes to train technology in so many ways. We could have a conversation about infrastructure. This is also a conversation about lobbies. This is a conversation about how far behind the U.S. as a first world country is in many areas, including train travel. Ultimately, we are going to learn the details of this particular crash. We will figure out, well, what happened to the train engineer? Was there any other safety system in place which did not work properly or which was not triggered? We'll learn about all that. But we also have to take a step back from it. And it doesn't reduce or increase the tragic nature of this casualty and the 100+ people that were killed. But we have to take a step back and say, hey, what is going on with trains in the United States? And it's really not good. Okay, let's take a break. We are on Reddit. You can go to davidpakman.com/Reddit, REDDIT. Join the discussion. Many new topics every day on our Reddit discussion forum. You can suggest interviews there. You can suggest stories. Always great to hear from people there. After the break, I think a lot of people are going to find this conversation interesting, but maybe surprising. We will be speaking to Elizabeth Savola about the fastest growing group of incarcerated individuals. What group is it? Well, we'll talk about that next.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined today by Liz Savola, who is a senior program associate at the Vera Institute of Justice and also one of the authors of the recent report, Overlooked: Women in Jails in an Era of Reform. Liz, it's so great to talk to you. Prisons and jails are often considered a sort of men's issue. The so-called men's rights movement often talks about it in that context. But you studied another angle of incarceration in the U.S., which is that we've seen a 14-fold increase in women in the correctional population over the last just under 45 years. What's driving that increase? Let's start sort of at the very top level.
Yeah, well, first, thanks so much for having me and for your interest in the report. As you said, we've seen a 14-fold increase in the number of women in jails. That's local, county, municipality-run facilities. And most of those people are pre-trial. So they've been arrested, but they haven't been convicted of anything. They're awaiting the resolution of their cases. And one thing that was really surprising in our research is that despite this dramatic growth, we don't still, to this day, know what's really driving it because there hasn't been much research specific to women. What we were able to find in our research about women kind of in the criminal justice system more generally is that an increasing focus on low-level, nonviolent offenses has really swept a large number of women into the system.
And when we talk about nonviolent offenses, I mean, I think because of what we've experienced within the war on drugs, oftentimes people's minds, when they hear nonviolent offenses, they think of sort of drug use, for example, possession, etc. But really, when we talk about nonviolent offenses, it includes more than just that, doesn't it? I mean, talk to us about some of the other nonviolent offenses that are landing people in jail and prison.
Right. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. A lot of it is drug possession, so not sales specifically for women, and it's property offenses, public order offenses, things like loitering, disorderly conduct. So we're talking about really minor, low-level crimes.
Talk to us a little bit about the dynamic in terms of how the criminal justice system sort of accounts for the reality that in the U.S., women are more likely, mothers are more likely to be the caregivers for children then are fathers, and sort of how that is impacting and influencing the numbers that we're seeing in terms of female incarceration.
Yeah, so the system really doesn't account for that dynamic, unfortunately. About 80% of women in jails are mothers. Oftentimes they are single mothers. And quite frequently when they are ending up in the criminal justice system, it's related to efforts to kind of survive. So as we said, it's property crimes. It can relate to mental health and behavioral health. And when they're coming into the system, that impacts their entire families, especially their children. Visiting can be very difficult. Even staying in touch by phone can be prohibitively expensive. Many of these families are poor and low income, and it can be very difficult for mother and child to stay in touch.
When we think about the incarceration of mothers, there's sort of this vicious cycle that can develop where we know that a child who has one or two parents that have been in the system, those children are more likely later on to end up in the system themselves. And there's this sort of vicious cycle that I've not really heard a particularly good explanation as to how it can be broken. But let me open up sort of that topic to you first. Talk a little bit about that, right? The impact that the incarceration of mothers has on the children, and whether you want to talk short, medium, and or long term, whichever way you want to go with it.
Yeah, so I mean, I think for children, when their parent, especially mother, is incarcerated, there can be a whole host of consequences. I mean, from the very first point of arrest, that can be incredibly traumatic for children. That can result in nightmares and stress and trouble at school. It's still an area of emerging research, really, what the long-term consequences are. But incarceration of children who have parents who are incarcerated has been, strongly correlated.
We know from having spoken to so many experts around these issues that when someone is incarcerated, they're often, to say rehabilitated is very, very far from the truth. They often come out of jail or prison actually more disadvantaged, less likely to ultimately find stable employment, etc. We know that generally. Does your report tell us anything more specifically about how that dynamic, the sort of furthering of the disadvantage, is affecting women who are incarcerated?
Absolutely. So when women come to jail, they're really experiencing a whole system with policies and practices that are designed for men. And that really does leave them worse off than when they came into jail. It can be anything as basic as hygiene, so having access to feminine hygiene products, having access to toilet paper, through to trauma. The jail experience can be incredibly traumatizing for women, many of whom have already experienced trauma in their lifetime. Nearly 90% have experienced sexual violence over the course of their lifetime. So when they come to jail and they are searched or shackled or held in solitary confinement, a lot of that trauma is re-triggered and can really leave them worse off. As well as financial consequences. Many women coming to jail are more disadvantaged even than their male counterparts. So about 60% of women who are in jail were unemployed before they came to jail. And so when they are leaving jail and they have all of these fines and fees that really rack up at every single point of the criminal justice process, they're even further economically disadvantaged.
This sort of gets us to one of the chicken egg discussions that often exists in these conversations, and I'll focus on the unemployment aspect of it because you brought it up. Some might hear this scenario, right? They hear you say incarceration rate of women has gone up so significantly. We also see 60% of women coming into the system are unemployed. So we should really be looking at arresting women less or changing laws in order to reduce the number of women arrested to begin with. Others will hear it and they'll say, well, the problem is really jobs, right? If we were able to grow employment and make it so that more women were employed and address the issues that exist there, that's just going to naturally reduce the number of women who end up in situations where they end up getting arrested. Is either of these approaches, does one or the other approach make more sense to you? Is it parts of both? Is it something else altogether?
Yeah, I think we really do need to look at both. I mean, incarceration is really a result of poverty, but also increasingly becoming a cause of poverty. We have to look at the very beginning of the system at arrest to think about ways that women can be diverted away from the criminal justice system so that they can engage in employment and education, treatment, they can stay with their families and maintain their housing. And think about, every step of the process, those opportunities to divert women away and to also reinvest in our communities instead of in incarceration to allow for more opportunities in the community. And so many of the communities that we work with here at the Vera Institute, very large amounts of their budget go towards incarcerating people. And, I think we feel that those resources would be better spent creating more opportunities in the community.
Now, Liz, there will be some who hear our conversation and they'll say, I agree with everything that Liz is saying. We do need to be focusing on all of those areas in order to reduce female incarceration. But shouldn't it really apply to both men and women? In other words, why is it that, or not why is it, but do you feel that there is a particular need to focus on reducing female incarceration as a result of certain types of crimes or economic situations or whatever? Or are you sort of merely pointing out that it has increased more rapidly than male incarceration, but really we should be making sure that we're treating everybody in the same way? And I ask this sort of because I know many in the audience will hear our conversation, and that's the first question I'll get.
Yeah, it's a good point. So most of the people in jail are men. Women do make up a smaller percentage, but they are, as you touched on, the fastest growing population in jail. And we are in this moment of reform where local communities are rethinking the way that they use their jails. And we absolutely encourage that for all people, both men and women. There should be opportunities to stay in the community while also being held accountable. But what we're seeing is that as reforms are coming up and new innovations are created, such as diversion programs, they're not always focusing on women and therefore aren't reaching as women to the extent that they're really reaching men. So it's important that we have conversations overall about reducing the use of jails, but there also be a specific focus on women to make sure that any reforms that are created are reaching them and providing them opportunities as well.
Last issue I want to touch on, if we had to point to one specific law enforcement initiative whose change might have the biggest impact, do you come to war on drugs and the status quo there?
I think there are many different factors. I think the war on drugs has certainly contributed significantly to the number of women in jails. I think communities are increasingly just relying on their jails to provide services that should be provided by the community, behavioral health, mental health, substance use treatment. There's really, the jails are the mental health providers of last resort, and we need to rethink that and make sure that resources are available in the community to prevent people from ending up in jail.
We've been speaking with Liz Swoboda, Senior Program Associate at the Vera Institute of Justice. The report is called Overlooked: Women in Jails in an Era of Reform. Liz, thanks so much for talking to us about this.
Thanks, David. My pleasure.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
There's an article that's been floating around on a website called Everyday Feminism, which the anti-feminists and the men's rights activists and the anti-social justice warriors hate, and they are absolutely going nuts about it. And the article claims to point out a variety of tactics that Donald Trump used during his first debate against Hillary Clinton that are being characterized as ways in which people are sometimes emotionally abused in relationships. And I've looked at the article, and I have to tell you, the article is very valid outside of the feminism context. A lot of people are talking about this in the form of a gender context, Trump oppressing or abusing the female Hillary Clinton, and it's on a website called Everyday Feminism. I want to ask you, as someone, if you are someone who has sort of anti-feminist tendencies, let's evaluate what the article says, not in the context of feminism or gender roles or men abusing women or anything like that. I just want to analyze this from a merely social engineering and manipulation perspective. And I believe that this is actually a very good article, and I think it's a distraction to write it off because of the website in which it appears. Let's take a look at the list now of the 10 ways in which Donald Trump manipulated during that first debate. And again, the website calls it emotional abuse. We can call it social engineering, manipulation, whatever. Number one, lying, okay? We covered this extensively. Donald Trump lied a lot during the first debate. And number two is denial. Denial is related to lying. Often the denials are lies. For example, denying that he ever said climate change is a hoax created by China. Okay, so denial and lying, I think we pretty much understand. Blame shifting is number three. When Donald Trump was asked about the many small businesses that he didn't pay when he built his business empire, he actually shifted the blame to business owners, saying maybe they just didn't do a good job. So blame shifting, another technique that Donald Trump used. Number four, moving goalposts. Donald Trump does this all the time. He did it several times during the debate. Lester Holt actually tried to sometimes remind him what the question is that was actually being discussed, just changing the topic of what it was he was discussing. And this is related to manipulation technique number five, which is bait and switch. It's similar to moving the goalpost. When Donald Trump was pressed about releasing his tax returns, he said, well, listen, I will release my tax returns when Hillary Clinton releases her 30,000 deleted emails. The audience somehow cheered for that, but that is a total bait and switch. There is no relation between the 40-year track record of candidates releasing their tax returns and what is going on with Hillary Clinton's emails. They're completely unrelated. Number six is projecting. Projecting is when the manipulator accuses someone else of doing that which they are being accused of. So Trump does this all the time. You'll remember when he had that situation where he referred to Megyn Kelly as someone who was bleeding out of her you-know-where type of thing. He was very, very aggressive and inappropriate with Megyn Kelly. He later discussed it as saying Megyn Kelly had been not nice to him. I mean, just textbook instance of projection. Number seven is generalizing and exaggerating. Trump does that all the time. Things are a disaster. They're tremendous. He uses the words everyone or always when he actually should be saying a few people and some of the time. This is a common one. I think we understand that. Yelling and shouting over, somewhere between 30 and 50 interruptions of Hillary Clinton during the debate. I think we understand that. Fear-mongering, everything terrible will happen if Mexican immigrants come to the U.S., if Hillary Clinton is the president, whatever. That one is easy to understand. And lastly is body shaming. He didn't directly body shame Hillary Clinton or the moderator this particular week. I guess he didn't find anything about Lester Holt's appearance he wanted to talk about, but he did slip in this comment about the 400-pound guy who might have done the hacking. And again, I don't understand how the weight of the hypothetical hacker is at all relevant here. So this is a very good list. If your takeaway from this list, Pat, is, oh, this is feminist nonsense, you're missing the point. I think that this is a very valid and worthwhile list to take a look at.
I'm not sure if you noticed this, but when Trump is being interrupted himself, he has this tactic of saying, excuse me.
Oh, yeah.
He did that once, and Hillary no longer interrupted him for the rest of the debate.
Yeah, it's a strong tactic. I mean, it works because part of it also can be if you're just the loudest person very often. If you imagine walking into rooms, and I've been in these rooms where there's one particular person in a social situation who is very clearly the loudest person in the room, even if you don't like or respect or agree with what that person is saying, you will very often start to acquiesce to the fact that they're sort of in charge of who is talking and when and how much time and how loudly. And the counter of, excuse me, of Donald Trump speaking over the interruption is really effective, and it worked during the Republican debates, and it certainly worked against Hillary Clinton. So listen, don't focus on the fact that the website is Everyday Feminism. You can remove this article completely from any feminist or gender ideals, and it's a very, very interesting article to look at. I want to follow up on a story from yesterday. Yesterday, I told you that another black man died unarmed, allegedly, after police shot him in California. Many people looked at the picture that is over my shoulder, and we can actually put up full screen for our audience that is watching. People looking at this picture and saying, well, if you look at the guy there in the black shirt, he looks like he's in what some describe as a shooting stance. So he might have had a firearm. He might not have had a firearm. We don't really know, but what officers did is completely defensible because he looks like he would be holding a firearm. Now, you'll notice this picture was taken from very far away. One of those officers seems to be about 8 feet away from this individual. So that certainly would be a concern. You would think that officer would know what it was that 38-year-old Alfred Olango had in his hand. So I'll show you some of the responses we received yesterday when we initially did this story. We'll put those up on the screen for people watching with us. This man was mentally challenged. He was mimicking the police because he didn't know any better. And the sister told the cops that when she called them, it was to help her brother. Another comment said, I don't understand why people just don't listen to police orders. Another comment, he put his hands out as if he had a firearm. When a person does some S like that to the police, the odds are high of getting shot. Maybe the problem is so many black people are showing willful ignorance, and or the media only wants to cover black people being shot by cops. Another comment, a stance like that is not negotiable. I would shoot him. And lastly, I can almost guarantee you're wrong, referring to me, David, about the fact that this was an allegedly unarmed man. Well, the police have spoken, and they've confirmed that indeed Alfred Olango had a vape smoking device in his hand, not a gun. Yes, he pointed his smoking device at police, and police shot and tasered him at the same time, killing him. And this is really the point I want to make to you here. People are emailing me saying, David, it doesn't matter what Alfred Olango had in his hand. He was in a shooting stance, period. Police instantly have to go on the defensive. And use of force, including deadly force, including what was in this case shooting and tasering this man, leading to his death at the same time, they had no choice but to do that. I think that that comment is hugely disrespectful to police. If what you're saying is police can be no better trained than if anyone goes like this, you shoot them dead, even if you're 8 feet away, I actually find that insulting. And I know police officers who, if you told them, listen, you're completely justified in shooting anyone who from 8 feet away goes like this, holding, here's a pen. This is effectively what he was holding, a vaping device, a vape cigarette like that. You're justified in shooting that person. I know police officers who would say, wait a second, no. My training is better than that. I don't, from 8 feet away, mistake a vape smoking device with a gun that could kill me. So if that's your argument, you are completely underestimating the skill of many police in this country. Not all. We know from the countless stories that we see that many police officers will take the opportunity, either out of fear or out of malice or whatever it may be, where when they have an e-cig or a vaping device pointed at them from 8 feet away, they'll say, this person now deserves to die. Most police officers would disagree with you, and they would say, no. We're better trained than to shoot anyone who holds up an e-cigarette. And I find it absolutely ridiculous that the defense is from 8 feet away, e-cigarette, stuffed animal, firearm, hot dog, it's all the same. If you hold it like this, you're getting killed by police. Despicable and absolutely disgusting. I do have a voicemail number, and that number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Let's take a listen to a voicemail that came in.
I'm not a well-educated person, but what I find peculiar in politics and religion is the greater the lie, the more warmly it is embraced.
Yeah, this is a comment relating to what we were discussing yesterday about Donald Trump told 34 lies during the first debate. Hillary Clinton told 6 lies during the first debate. Yet Donald Trump is by and large seen as more honest and trustworthy. Donald Trump accuses other people of lying. And lying is an unusual thing, and it can have unpredictable and sometimes illogical effects on people who hear the lies. On today's bonus show, we have started to see ads seeking female students from sugar daddies on the University of New Hampshire campus. We're going to talk about that. We are also going to talk about, we did a story a while ago about something called shade balls in California, which were an experimental method of saving water. It turns out that it has worked, and we're going to talk about that on the bonus show and much more. You can sign up at davidpakman.com/membership.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.